Success. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you're well. Today it's Rabbi Akiva Mills in Memphis, Tennessee, and today is the 13th of August, and it is the 13th of August, and we're getting ready for Parshas Ekev, and I hope to share some sources with you that will make this a bit more meaningful. So let's see. Right towards the beginning of the Parsha, in fact, these are the first psukim of the Parsha, you'll notice that there's a word missing. It says as follows: the Parsha begins, Vaya Ekev Tishmuun Ela Mishpatim Ha'ela, and will be because you heed these ordinances. Mishpatim is usually the term that's used in the Torah to talk about the mitzvos that are almost like self-explainable. The ones that we would know on our own. It makes sense to have rules and regulations about thievery, rules against murder, rules about honoring our parents. These are all the kind of statutes that we would come up with on our own. So it says, "Vaya ekev tishmud al mishpatim ha'ela." It'll be that because you keep these ordinances, ushmartem v'asisim osam, you observe them and you perform them. V'shamar Hashem elokecha l'chas habris v'sachesed. So then God, in His part, will keep up His end of the covenant and the kindness asher nishpal avasecha that He promised our ancestors. And then a couple of psukim later in Tesvav and 15 it says, what's the result of our keeping our end of the covenant? V'hisir Hashem imcha kol choli. God will remove from you all illness. Who wouldn't want all illness to disappear? The Torah is telling us that if we would live up on a national level, not just as individuals, but as an entire people, keep our end of the covenant, God would see to it that we are a healthy people. V'chol madvei Mitzrayim harayim, and all of the evil diseases which had befallen on Egypt, asher yadata, that we all knew firsthand, lo yisimam bach, He will not set on us, unisanam b'chol sanecha, but instead He will lay them upon our enemies. So it sounds like an incredible deal. All we've got to do is keep the mishpatim, and if we upend all our end of the bargain, the Torah gives us a number of promises of just how good life will be for the Jewish people. One of them is this pasuk here that clearly says that we will know of no illness, and all of the terrible things that had fallen on Egypt will never fall on us, and instead will fall upon our enemies. Now, let's just contrast this to a pasuk in Beshalach. The Torah tells us in Beshalach, in Sefer Shemos, shortly after leaving Egypt, and we arrived at one of our first stops in the wilderness where we were given fresh water to drink. The Torah tells us, God, through Moses, tells Moshe to tell the Jewish people that if we would only listen to everything God asks of us, and we do all that is proper in God's eyes, and we listen to His commandments, and we observe all of His chukim. What's the translation of chukim? Chukim are the mitzvos that what? That we don't understand, that we don't have a rational explanation for, like shatnez, men not shaving with a razor, this idea that we can eat fish that have scales and fins, but if they don't have scales, like a catfish, I can't eat it. Why? I don't know what's the difference. Hashem asked us to. One day He'll let us know, but in the meantime, we don't know. So here the Torah says, if we observe all the chukim, all of the illness that I had brought upon Egypt, I will not place on you. Because I am the Lord who heals you. So I saw that the Meshech Chochmah raises a point. This totally went over my eyes in the past. We have two very similar sets of psukim. In this week's Parsha, Ekev begins telling us if we keep the mishpatim, if we keep the ordinances, which is generally understood to be the mitzvahs, which we could come up with a reason for it. They make sense. There's a rational explanation. Then Hashem will make sure that we do not get inflicted with any of the illness that hit Mitzrayim. But in Sefer Shemos, in Parshas Beshalach, it's a little bit different. There God says, if you keep all the chukim, then you won't get nailed with the illness of Egypt. So why the difference? Why in one place is it chukim? Why in one place is it mishpatim? And this never caught my eye before, but it should have. But I saw that the Meshech Chochmah, Rev Meir Simcha Cohen of Dvinsk, he is bothered by this. So let's see what the Meshech Chochmah says. He says, "V'haya ekev tishmun." The Meshech Chochmah writes as mishpatim ha'ila. And if we keep all the mishpatim, then the Torah guarantees us, "Ve'sir Hashem mimcha kol choli." So he first starts by telling us, Re'eh ba'akedah, he tells us, excuse me, to look in the sefer called the Akedah. The Akedah was, I believe it was a contemporary of Rambam, and the Akedah was a very philosophical work written by one of our early Rishonim, Dvarim Misukim. He goes, you'll see on this, the Akedah brings down a beautiful, beautiful drasha. I didn't look up the Akedah. One version of the Meshech Chochmah that I saw in the footnotes quotes parts of it, but it doesn't really pertain to what I wanted to get to. So that's why I didn't delve into it. So first thing that Meshech Chochmah did, he says, if you want to see something really beautiful, look at the Sefer Akedah. Okay, that's our homework we have for us to look up this Akedah. But let's see what the Meshech Chochmah now does. He goes, V'yitaken lo sifal dvarav. But I would like to add something beyond what the Akedah dealt with in this pasuk. I would like to add something more. Ki ka'asher nisbalel divrei Torah begufam. The Jewish people have just spent 40 years in the wilderness. The Torah has been totally absorbed into their bodies. They spent 40 years eating man, heavenly food. They've spent 40 years drinking the be'er, which was miraculous water. They've learned Torah day and night from Moshe. This has been an incredible spiritual journey that the Jewish people have gone on for 40 years in the wilderness, and we are now catching them at the end of it. Now that after 40 years, the words of the Torah have been totally absorbed, been imbibed into their bodies, and they have withstood and successfully overcome incredible amount of tests over the last 40 years. Now it makes sense. Whereas 40 years ago, mitzvos, which were chukim, which they had no explanation for, all those same mitzvos can now be properly categorized as mishpatim. They were all perfectly understandable. He's saying that these Jewish people have gone through a metamorphosis. You know why in Sefer Shmos the Torah says if you keep the chukim, then I'll deliver you. You won't have any of those illnesses. And then here it says if you keep the mishpatim, it's not two different ideas. It's the same chukim. At this point in the Jewish people's journey, at this point in their evolution, the chukim were perfectly understandable. They understood. It all made perfect sense to them why they ought to be doing and keeping, observing all these mitzvahs and having that relationship with Hashem. Ki nefesh hazach v'bahir, because at this point, their souls were so pure. They were purified. Masig, they were able to comprehend mashe ma'achalos ubios asuros mitamteim hanefesh. They can now understand the laws of kosher. Yeah, if I don't keep kosher laws, it's going to block up my soul, keep me from getting close to God. If I engage in forbidden relationships that the Torah doesn't want me to engage in, what do you mean everyone's consenting adults? Why should God care? No, now they were so spiritually attuned. They understood. They were able to comprehend. No, that's going to have cosmic significance on my relationship with God. So at this point, some of the most trying mitzvos, you might say, which could have been the greatest nisayon for, the laws of kosher, the laws of relationships, the Jewish people, they intuitively understood, no, those are going to get in the way of my spiritual journey to get close with God, and therefore, that's going to distance that brightness of getting close to God that I so desire. Lanashim Ka'ela, for that generation, for the Ochle Man, for that generation who had spent 40 years eating the man and drinking the be'er and being daily recipients of God's miracles, Lanashim Ka'ela Nechshav Chukim Lemishpatim. Everything which had been previously termed as Chukim, for them, at this point in their spiritual development, they're now Mishpatim. What an amazing thing. What the Meshech Chochmah was bothered by, again, if you look at these psukim, it seems like something's wrong. In Sefer Shemos, the same promise was made, but the promise was made, if you keep the chukim, then you won't have any of those, all the chole Mitzrayim, all of the illness of Egypt. But here we say, if you keep the mishpatim, you won't have it. Why are you changing the terms? It's the same covenant. However, at this point in the spiritual development of the Jewish people, what previously had been chukim so impossible to comprehend and to understand, now they were attuned to. It all made sense. What a fascinating idea. I love the fact that the Meshech Chochmah brought this seeming contradiction, this challenge to light, and I love the way he dealt with it. And he's telling us that, yes, we can evolve. Things which had been incomprehensible in our past, the more spiritually fine-tuned we become, we can now all of a sudden understand, okay, that makes sense. That's going to get in the way of my relationship with God. What previously had been a chok is now mishpat. I think that idea is fascinating. And what fascinated me about this is it jogged my memory. It made me realize I've seen this before. I've seen this concept before, and I want to share it with you. Let's go to page two. Page two is a passage from the Haggadah Shal Pesach that I think every one of us will instantly recall because we're all, who's not familiar with Pesach? We all love Pesach. And the Haggadah, it's so close to our hearts. So at one point we say Rebbe Gamliel taught that anyone who goes through the Pesach Seder and doesn't fully explain and speak out the three major mitzvahs of Pesach, Matzah, Maror, they haven't fully fulfilled their obligations. And now let's focus on what does he say about matzah. So it says, Nagada matzah zushano ochlim, this matzah, which we're going to eat at the Seder, al shuma. What's the reason behind it? Al shum shlo hispik b'tzeikam shel avosenu lahachmitz, is that God didn't give us enough time for our dough to rise. Ad shenigla aleim melech malchei amlachim, until God revealed himself to them, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ugalam, and suddenly redeemed them. Shenemar, because the pasuk says in Shemos, Vayofu es habatzek asher hotziu mimitzrayim, they had to bake the dough which they left Egypt with, ugos matzos, they made matzah bread, ki lo chametz, it never had time to rise, ki gorshu mimitzrayim, because it never had time to leaven, because they were chased out of Egypt, v'lo yochlu mismameya, they couldn't dally at all, they couldn't delay, v'gam seido lo asulam, and they didn't prepare any other food. So if you ask anyone who's ever attended a Pesach Seder, who's paid attention, why do we eat matzah at the Pesach Seder? They'll say, because it's symbolic of what we left Egypt with. We left Egypt having these fresh dough patties that did not have time to rise. We had to rush out with them and bake them over coals in the wilderness, and that's how we ended up with this. That was the bread that they had. That was the bread that they had. That was matzah. And when we eat matzah at the Seder, that reminds us of the haste in which we left Egypt. Simple, if you ask any of us. But here's the question. A number of our commentators ask this, and we'll see it in the Avudraham. The Avudraham was one of our Rishonim, early commentaries from Spain, and he says this doesn't make all that much sense, because if you look back at Parshas Bo, the first Pesach Seder that ever took place was taking place where? In Egypt. Had they already left Egypt? No. What was one of the important components to have at that Seder? Matzah, right. At this point, could they sit around the table and say, why are we eating matzah? Oh, because when we left, they haven't left yet. They have no idea. So let's see what the pasuk says. The pasuk says, this is in Parshas Bo, this is telling us about the first Pesach Seder in Egypt. V'lachum min adam, they're supposed to take from the blood of the Paschal lamb that's been slaughtered, v'nasnu al shtei mezuzos, and to paint it on the two doorposts. V'al mashkof, and also on the lintel. V'al alabatim, on the houses, asher yochlu asobem, where they're going to eat the korban Pesach. Next one, v'achluas habasar b'layla hazeh, they're going to eat the flesh of that korban Pesach that night. Tzlialesh, it's got to be roasted over fire. Umatzos al mirorim yochluhu, and it needs to be eaten with matzos, unleavened bread, and also bitter herbs. That's how it's got to be eaten. So the Avudraham asks the question on the Haggadah. This is in the section of the Avudraham where he goes through the Pesach Haggadah. So let's see where it's bolded. Pesach al shem she Pesach. Why is it called Pesach? Fine. Matzah zushanu ochlim. Why do we eat matzah? Al shem shelo hispik v'tzeikam shavasenu lachmitz, because the dough of our ancestors did not have time to rise. Yesh lishol. There's an important fundamental question that needs to be asked. Kitzivo yachilas matzos lo hayamitam shelo hechmitz b'tzeikam. The reason why we were commanded to eat matzahs at the Pesach Seder cannot be because of the fact our dough did not have time to rise. Ki kodem lachein tzivo lecho matzos b'stam. Because prior to the Exodus, the first Pesach Seder that was done in Egypt, the Jews were already commanded to eat matzah. V'lo amar tam l'davar. God didn't give them this reason. He said, have Pesach, have at your Pesach Seder, have matzah. So you can't tell me the reason we have matzah at a Pesach Seder is because we left in such a jiffy that we didn't have time for it to rise. That doesn't explain why there must be something more to the matzah, because they had it at the first Seder before there was an Exodus. L'chein perish Rabbi Yosef Kimchi. Therefore, the great Rabbi Yosef Kimchi explains as follows: Shema shenitztavu al matzos kodem l'chein. That you're right. Starting from Pesach Seder number 2 and on, You know why we had matzah? To remember how we left in a haste. But what about that initial Pesach Seder? Why did they have matzah then? He says, Haya al Shema Asid. It was just because of the future. It was setting the template. God is setting the template. This is what a Pesach Seder is supposed to look like. But nobody knows the reason why they're eating matzah at that first Pesach Seder. We're having this funny hard bread over here. Nobody knows why. If you asked anybody, why are you eating matzah at that first Seder? Matzah zu shanu ochlim al shuma. All they would say is, because God said so. They have no explanation. Pesach number two, they could say, because, yeah, we didn't have time and to let our dough rise, so we had to bake what we had. Shashem Yodea Sidos. God knows the future. And God knows, Yada Shahayalam Latses Mimsam Chipazon. He knows that eventually, when they're going to leave, tomorrow, they're going to leave in a real haste. And even if they wanted to tarry, their dough would never have a chance to rise. Therefore, therefore, the first Pesach Seder, before this whole event has occurred, they've already been given the command. They've already been told that they've got to eat it with matzah and maror, lechol shivas yom matzah, and to eat for the next 7 days to eat matzah. So what the Avud Raham is setting up is as follows. He's saying, I don't get this. Every year in the Haggadah, we say the reason why we eat matzah is because we had to leave in such a jiffy. We were in such haste, our bread didn't have time to rise, so we were left with matzah. That can't be the reason, because they were initially told at the first Pesach Seder, still in Egypt, to have matzah. So he says the way Rav Yosef Kimchi answers that is he says, you're right. For all Pesach Seders from year two and on, year two of the Exodus and on, the reason why there's matzah is because they didn't have time for the dough to rise. But at Pesach Seder number one, you know why they're eating matzah? Because God said so. And why did God say so? Because that's setting the template of what a Pesach Seder is supposed to be. But you're right. At that first Pesach Seder, if you went around the table and said, Matzah zushan oklam al shuma, everyone would have had a blank look on their face and said, beats me. It's because God said so. That's what it would have been. I saw, and this will be on page number 3. We're not going to read it all inside, but I saw a beautiful follow-up on this. The Beis Halevi. So this is the original Rav Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik. So in his Perush on Chumash, he says, he quotes a medrash that talks about how in the future, in the Messianic age, the greatest chukim, the greatest unexplainable mitzvos will all become perfectly understandable to us. And he says it as an example. You know what's an example how we can make this lesson come close to home? Look at matzah. This is exactly what he says. He says, if you would have asked any Jews experiencing that first Pesach Seder, why eating that hard bread? Wouldn't you rather have regular bread? They all would have said, I have no clue. It's a chok. God said do it. So I'm doing it. But year number 2, it makes perfect sense. It's clear as day why we're eating matzah. Because we didn't have time to rise, and we need to remember that great miracle every year. He says, look at that. Look what happened. Something which was so hidden, which was so inexplicable, a year earlier was the ultimate, it was a chok, just as much as paraduma. A year later, so understandable. The Beis Halevi says that's how we could understand that medrash, that in the Yemos HaMashiach, in the Messianic age, the greatest chukim, the greatest inexplainable mitzvahs that God's asking us to observe and to make part of our national mission, and we can't explain, there's no rational explanation for it, have no fear. One day it'll be clear as day. It'll be crystal clear. When Mashiach comes, he'll explain it all to us, and then it'll just like matzah. That's the ultimate example of a chok that becomes perfectly understandable. All other chukim will be perfectly understandable as well. That's what the Beis Halevi points out in his lesson from this. And what I love, look how it dovetails with this Meshech Chochmah, because the Meshech Chochmah is telling us there was already a point in our national development where our ancestors were so spiritually attuned, they were so their senses were so sharpened that they were able to discern and say there's no difference. Chukim mishpatim. I may not be able to give you the full explanation to it, to tell you why it is in the great cosmic scheme of things. Why is it that non-kosher food blocks my connection to God? But I know it. I feel it. I could tell. I could tell that I want to be close to God, and what I eat is going to impact that. So I'm going to be very careful. I want to be so close to God, and those forbidden relationships that the Torah seemingly puts so many obstacles in the path of one's desire. And who cares? Everyone's consenting adults. Why does the Torah care? They say we're sensitive enough to realize that there's something going on here spiritually. If we want to connect with God, one of the ways to make that happen is to make sure there's no spiritual blockages. And engaging in those forbidden relations are going to cause those spiritual blockages. I want to make sure to abstain from that. It was clear as day to them. And that's how the Meshech Chochmah explains why in our Parsha in Ekev, he uses the word mishpatim. If you observe the mishpatim, which are the ordinances that we all understand, that'll protect you from the Cholei Mitzrayim. Whereas back in Bishalach, it said, if you keep the chukim, if you keep those inexplicable mitzvos, that'll protect us from the Cholei Mitzrayim. Now there's no difference. Those chukim, which were so inexplicable back in Bishalach, now it comes to Ekev. Those are mishpatim. They were able to discern, and they could say, I understand that they may not have been able to write a whole treatise on it, but they could say, no, we clearly are spiritually developed enough that we can understand engaging in that behavior is going to get in the way of my neshama being able to connect with God, so I'm going to abstain. So here it is this beautiful idea, is that as we evolve spiritually, our senses become sharpened, they become more focused, and what had been so difficult for us to comprehend all of a sudden becomes so much more understandable and really can become almost second fiddle for us. Because mishpatim, again, our ordinances, that make sense. All the interpersonal ordinances about not stealing, not harming one another, those all make sense. That's intuitive. The chukim can be just as intuitive depending on our spiritual level that we're able to reach. And I think that's something that just really, really is a strong lesson for us. And again, look how this dovetails so beautifully with that lesson of the matzah. And the Beis Halevi says it's something that we can look forward into the Messianic age. If we're ever hung up on a chok, if we're ever saying, like, I'm just having a hard time with it, stick with the program. Stick with the program. Either we'll become spiritually more developed, so it'll start to feel right to us, like what happened to Bnei Yisrael in Parshas Ekev, or God willing, Mashiach will be here tomorrow. And at that point, this medrash will come into its effect, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu will sit down with us and give us a shir and help us understand all the reasons behind the chukim. So just hang on, a little bit of patience, and we could all get there. I love this idea, and I'm so happy that the Meshech Chochmah pointed this out, because again, I never caught that discrepancy, and I love the lesson from it, and I love how it dovetails with this lesson of the matzah. It really becomes all one and the same, and I think that's beautiful. That's Dvar Torah number one I wanted to share with you. Dvar Torah number two I wanted to share with you is that sometimes we make the mistake of thinking the Torah is a history book. Now, there's a lot of history that we find in the Torah, but we have to remember it's not necessarily a history book, it's a lesson book. Torah means to teach, to give lessons, and that's what the Torah does. It sometimes drives us batty that we wish the Torah would give us more details. If it was a real history book, we'd be flush with details. We'd want to know, well, tell me a little bit about what color hair Moshe Rabbeinu had. Let me know about I don't know, our imahos. If Sarah really was so beautiful, let me know a little bit. What was it that made her so beautiful? Let me know about this. But the Torah doesn't do that. There's so many details that the Torah just doesn't give us. But sometimes, if we go between the lines, we can dig out some more, and especially Torah Shebaal Peh, our oral traditions sometimes help us do that. There's a pasuk in this week's parsha, and Rashi really goes to town here, and Rashi is really quoting some Chazal, and this dovetails with a Rashi that's in Parshas Pinchas that really, I want to share this with you, and then we'll speak out something from Rav Sternbach on it. So let's see, we're in, a little bit later in the Parsha. I believe it's in the fourth Aliyah. So it's chapter 10, that's Perek Yud, Pasuk Vav. It tells us, as Moshe Rabbeinu is going through the story of our years in the wilderness. It says, "Bnei Yisrael nasu be'eros bnei Akan." The Jewish people, we journeyed from the wells of Bnei Akan, Mosera, to a place called Mosera. Sham, when we were at Mosera, Mes Aaron, that's where Aaron passed. The Kaver Sham, that's where he was buried. Vayichahin Elazar beno tachtav, and his son Elazar was appointed to serve as Kohen in his stead. So let's see Rashi. Rashi here says as follows: Ubnei Yisrael nasu mi be'eros bnei Akan Mosera. So he says, Ma inyan zelakan. What's the relevance of this information? V'od, and furthermore, v'chime be'eros bnei Akan nasu Mosera. Does that make sense? If we look at the actual record in the Torah, did the Jewish people really trek from the wells of Bnei Yakan to Mosera? Valomi Mosera bo Bnei Yakan. It was really the opposite. Shenamar, because the Torah says Vayisume Moseros. They went from Mosera to Bnei Yakan. V'od, and another question on this pasuk: Shames Aaron. Aaron died in Moseira? No. Valo Bahora Hormes. The Torah clearly tells us in Parshas Chukas that Aaron died on the hill called Hor HaHor, the hill, one hill on top of the hill, a mountain on a mountain. So he says, Seva Chashov, he says, if you would go back and look at how this all played out in Sefer Bamidbar, V'timsa, you'll find Shmona Masaos, there were actually 8 different journeys, 8 stops, Mimoseros Lahar Hahar, from Moseros to Har Hahar. So what's going on in this pasuk? Everything seems so odd in this pasuk. So Rashi says, Ela avzu minatochecha. This is actually part of the rebuke. Moshe Rabbeinu at this point, he's kind of telling the Jews that they gave him a run for his money, gave him a tough time during the years in the wilderness. So he says as follows. He says, V'od zos asisem. I want to tell you what else you've done. Kishemes Aaron, right after Aaron died in Parshas Chukas, here he's telling us in between the lines. Bahor. Where did Aaron die? He died at Har. The Sofar Ba'im Shana, at the end of the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. V'nistalku ananei kavod. Because Aaron died, and it was in his merit that we had those protective clouds. So when Aaron died, we lost the clouds. Yireisam, you panicked, and you became very fearful. You were very nervous that we were going to get attacked by one of the local kings, who was the king of Arad. Unisatem Rosh, you appointed a leader. Lachzor Mitzrayim. After 40 years of trekking to go to Israel, you panicked after Aaron died, and you said, let's appoint a leader, let's go back to Egypt. V'chezartem lacharechem. You actually, a good chunk of the Jewish people turned around. Shmona masaos. You actually went back 8 stops at Bnei Yakan. Umisham Mosera, and from there you went to Mosera. Sham nilchamu b'chem b'nei Levi, but then what happened was Shevet Levi basically said, no, we're not going to see this happen. We're not going to see this split, that a massive chunk of the Jewish people is fleeing and abandoning camp that's going to demoralize everyone. So basically, who went back to bring law and order? That same Shevet Levi that at the incident of the golden calf, they went down, they put a militia together, and they said, we're chasing after that runaway band of Jews that wants to go back to Egypt. We're chasing back 8 stops, and we're going to threaten them. Come back with us, rejoin the Jewish people, or we're going to war with you. And he says, Sham nilchamu b'chem b'nei Levi. The Jewish people were so panicked, they wouldn't want to rejoin the Jewish people to go to Israel. So they said, we're going back to Egypt. So the Levium went to war. V'hargu michem, and they ended up killing a number of you. There was a fight over this. And you killed some of the Levium as well. Until they were finally successful at convincing you, no, your destiny is with the Jewish people and you have to rejoin them. Umisham, from there, Hazartem HaGudgoda, that's when you return to Gudgoda, rejoin the Jewish people, Uchor HaGidgod. That's what the Torah now refers to. So he's telling us is the Torah didn't even tell us this detail, but hidden in this pasuk are these details that as soon as Aaron died, there was this panic that kicked in amongst a significant group of Am Yisrael. They appointed a leader to take them back to Egypt to come up with some kind of treaty with the Egyptians to let us come back. We're really sorry that 40 years ago what we did to you and that we left and we want to come back. And Shevet Levi goes off to pursue them, says, no, this is going to be cataclysmic, destructive for the Jewish people. You're rejoining. They got into a fight over this. They killed a number of the Jews. The Jews killed a number of Levium until finally they were convinced and they rejoined. What an episode. The Torah doesn't tell us anything about this, but Rashi's pointing out this is all hidden in the lines in this pasuk. I put there as a bullet point, see also Parshas Pinchas. This is where you'll also see Rashi points this out. It's in Bamidbar, and it's specifically in Rashi there, Divrei Maschel Lazera. Now, what's going on there? Rashi's puzzled by when it's going through a counting of the various tribes in Parshas Pinchas, some of the numbers just don't add up, and some of the families aren't listed that were listed earlier. And Rashi brings this all down again, and he surmises, you know why some of the families aren't listed? They died. They died in this battle. You know why some of the numbers don't appear? Because they died in this battle. Something terrible happened after Aaron died, and it's really kind of shrouded in mystery, and this is revealed in the text there. So again, look what could happen, what panic could do, and cause people, after 40 years, they're ready to it's happened a couple times in the Midbar that they said, let's put a group together and go back to Egypt, but they never acted on it. They actually acted on it, and they're fleeing, and they go to war over this. This is absolutely, absolutely wild. But we should never dismiss the potential of what panic could cause a person to do. Panic makes all rationale, all reason go out the window. And here it is. They've been provided for 40 years in the wilderness with heavenly mud, heavenly bread. You'd logically say God didn't bring us this far to now just drop us. But what happened? The ananim, the anane kavod dissipate, and now they say, "Uh-oh, that's it, gone." Why don't they just wait and see? Do we still have the mun? Do we still have this? They probably panicked and said, now we don't have God's protection. We're finished. The only way we've been functioning till now is God's protection. It's gone. Maybe it's gone now because we're at the end of our journey. We're at the end of our journey. We're not going to need that anon. God's going to be with us all the promises. But again, panic kicked in and chaos ensues, and that's what happened. Let's see. I want to add one thing left here from Rabbi Sternbach because Rashi did a great job. But if you look back at the pasuk, let's look at the pasuk one more time. The pasuk now makes a lot of sense, except for the last bit of it. The pasuk said, "Uvnei Yisrael nasumi beros b'nei Yaakov Mosera," and then it says Sham Meis Aaron and Vayikaver Sham, and he was buried there. Okay, so I get it. This all kind of is between the words. What happened? But what's this next line? Vayechahen Elazar beno tachtav, and his son Elazar was in his stead to take over for Aaron. How does that fit into this whole narrative about this, or what was cloaked in secrecy about this mutiny and this effort to split the people and run away, and how Shevet Levi brings everyone back? What does that have to do with Elazar was appointed in Aaron's stead? So let's look at this last point on page 4. This is Rav Sternbach. Rav Sternbach says, "Adayin tzarich iyun." What we still, even after this Rashi, what we still need to understand is, "Ma'nin lakan shekihem b'no tachtav." Why is Moshe adding the point that Elazar, who is Aaron's son, took over in Aaron's place? V'nira, it appears, Dinei tam mashadamu chazal petiras tzadikim l'shviras haluchos. Chazal tell us, because again, that was also part of the juxtaposition here. Moshe had just finished talking about smashing the luchos, about the first set of tablets that he had gotten. So he says, when Chazal tell us that when a tzaddik, when a great righteous Jew passes away, that's almost as comparable to Moshe smashing the luchos, the tablets. Hu ki haluchos lo niskaimu lam Yisrael kishlo zakon v'ruyim lakach. What does it mean? Is that we didn't deserve the luchos. If we don't deserve the luchos, because we had built the golden calf, since we didn't deserve the luchos, that's why they were taken from us. That's why they were smashed. Af HaKadosh Baruch Hu, on a similar vein, God also is Malaket Shoshanav. God collects his roses, meaning God brings back the precious neshamas they love to him. Eloat Tzadikim, those precious righteous Jews, Kishe'en Ador Roy Lakach. If we don't deserve our righteous Jews, God takes them from him. So the same way that this is what caused the panic. The Jewish people see, why did we lose the luchos? We sinned with the golden calf, so we didn't deserve them. So that's why he took them. So now what happened? Aaron dies. So why did he take Aaron? Oh my God, it must be we are so guilty, we didn't deserve Aaron. Ukisharo Yisrael. So when the Jewish people saw Shemes Aaron HaKohen, that the great Aaron the Kohen died, Hevinu, they understood, Shezehu beginam, it was because of them, meaning we no longer deserve to have him in our midst. Shein malasum shlema, we must not be as wholesome as we thought we were. Veinam zakaim sheyishken bekirbam tzadik hador, and we didn't merit that this righteous soul of the generation should reside in our midst. Chazru lacharem. That's what caused them to panic. It wasn't just that the clouds went away. It was specifically that Aaron had died and they lost this great tzaddik. That's what caused them to panic. Yes, the clouds contributed a huge role, but the major thing was they read into it and they said, oh my God, if we could lose Aaron, that means that we're on a very low level and we don't deserve God's protection anymore. And despite the fact that his son Elazar was appointed in his stead, they said, we're scared. We're scared to continue on this mission under the leadership of his son, Shalach b'derech aviv, even though the son had acted as righteous as his father, v'ratzu lachzor Mitzrayim. And that's what caused them to panic and said, we're going to Egypt. In other words, they saw that they lost Aaron, his son took over, and that wasn't good enough for them. They became consumed with self-doubt and panic and fear, and they decide a massive break off going back to Egypt. Ubnei Levi, but contrast that, how did Bnei Levi react? The children of Levi, Asher Nilchemu Bem, that were willing to go to war to fight to bring them back, Heim Lo Nafal Rucham B'Kirbam. They never became demoralized. They never became depressed. They never became disengaged from their mission. They said, we're going to continue acting in the ways of Aaron. The Kiblu Aleim Kuhunas Benon. They accepted on him. He has a righteous son who took over for him. We're going to follow his leadership. Afshu Roy Aaron, because he's as fit as Aaron was. That's why the Torah mentions that same event of Elazar taking over had drastically different effects on two different segments of the Jewish people. One segment said, we lost the great kahuna, the big kahuna, in a certain sense. It was true. They lost Aaron HaKohen. And they said, that must mean we're so unworthy. We don't merit having God on our side. We're panicking. They run back to Mitzrayim. Shevet Levi looks at that same event and they say, Nebuch, we lost Aaron. But look what he did. God gave him an heir. He gave him Elazar, who is so righteous, just like his father was. And we trust in his leadership. We're not going to allow that panic to take us over. And they try to talk sense to the rest of the ones who fled. They were successful with many, but they lost so many of them as well. But look what's going on here. This adds a whole another layer into our understanding of what went on in Sefer Bamidbar and the trials and the tribulations of the Jewish people in the Midbar. And here's one that, again, would have gone completely unnoticed, perhaps, had Rashi not taken the time to point this out to us. But once he does, now this whole episode becomes so much more, I would say, vibrant, and it makes more of this, the journey in the wilderness, just come alive for us. But again, I think that the main thing to remember here is not to get panicked. Yes, there are indications we can read. We can say we're reading the leaves, we're reading the tea leaves, whatever it is. But just consult before they go on this panic and run. They say the clouds disappeared. That's terrible. Aaron died. That's terrible. Must mean. Consult with Moshe Rabbeinu. Consult with Shevet Levi. Shevet Levi saw the same thing and they didn't despair. Why? Because they had the way they process this differently. So yes, we can all see the same idea. To one group, it can cause despair. To one, they could say, we can deal with this. But if a person is feeling despair, don't just act on it. Talk it out. Seek consultation from leadership, from others, from friends, spouse, whoever it may be. They may help us get through that. But if we just react purely on based on what our instincts are and what our reflexes are, we can make an awful mistake. And that's what happened here to a good chunk of the Jewish people. And again, this is only alluded to in this psukim, and Rashi really kind of pulls it out from between the words, between the texts. But you see, this is Torah Shabbal Peh, and this is the way Chazal understood what had occurred, when Aaron died. And as I said, go back to Parshas Pinchas. You'll see Rashi over there uses this to help us understand why there are missing families, heads of families that just don't appear when it's going down the list in Parshas Pinchas. He says, yeah, Nebuch. Unfortunately, those are the ones that had really panicked and didn't make it back. And within Shevet Levi as well, there was some Shevet Levi who died in the conflict as well. So that's what happened there. So again, that's what I would just bring out. Look how this Rashi just helps us better understand an episode that really is not spoken about at all in the Torah. And the lessons that we can learn from this is that if we do see something that's causing us to despair, before we act on it, let's not be so reflexive. Before we act on it, let's consult others, especially if there's a major decision that needs to be made. Let's consult others. Let's talk it through, and let's see, is all my panic, is that panic, is it something which is worthwhile? Is it something which makes sense? Is it dignified? Or should I get over it and find what coping mechanisms, what tools can I use to get past that? If we do that, we can be saving ourselves a lot of heartache and sometimes from far worse as well. All right, I'm gonna end here. I'm gonna turn off the recording. If anyone has something that they'd like